Good afternoon, everyone. I am Corinne Grant from Médecins Sans Frontières, MSF, and I would like to welcome you all warmly to the Humanitarian Congress Berlin 2021. This year's topic is Aspiring Towards Global Justice, a Humanitarian Imperative. We are in tumultuous times, and humanitarian action needs to think beyond its own boundaries. We operate amidst an 18-month-long pandemic, where there are growing instances of social outcries, protests, social movements, situations of political oppression, economic and social injustice, and unrelenting state or non-state violence. The Humanitarian Congress Berlin 2021 intends to take stock on this challenging landscape and explore the intersection between humanitarian action and global justice. In the coming 4 days, till Thursday, we will be hosting a series of panel discussions on topics such as protest and civil movements. Actually, this session already happened this morning for those who would like to tune in again. European migration politics, decolonization of global health, planetary and environmental health, management of misinformation in or within communities, universal social protection, faith-based organizations as first responders, and many more interesting topics. Please check the agenda. These panel discussions will build on the sessions we hosted in the past 2 years. Crucial conversations happened, and we thought it was important to continue these conversations this year. We will hopefully push the reflection in the humanitarian sector further in order to better respond to political, social, economic causes of acute vulnerability and humanitarian needs. What a program. We will start today's reflection with Dr. Firoze Manji. Dr. Manji is a renowned academic with many titles and awards. He currently is the adjunct professor at the Institute of African Studies in Carleton, Ottawa, Canada. He has published widely on health, human rights, development, and politics. Welcome, Firoze. I will hand over to you for your keynote speak, and I welcome all our audience online to please pose questions on the chat, and after the keynote speech, we will address your questions. Thank you, and here's to you, Firoze.
Thank you very much, and thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to this event to speak. It's a real honor because, humanitarians perform an important function, and there are so many of you who devote your lives and put yourself in danger. And so the discussion that we need to have today is not about the heroism of humanitarians, but rather the context in which we are dealing with humanitarian crisis of humanity, and indeed crisis of the planet, faced with climate chaos. Really, to begin with, some of you may remember that last month was the 20th anniversary of the destruction of the Twin Towers in New York. And I don't know if you listened to the radio or watched it on television, but the day was spent reciting the names of those who tragically lost their lives in this terrible event. But why was it that we were not able to list, never mind recite, the names of the Afghans, the Iraqis, the Libyans, Somalis, and so on and so forth? How is it that the names of the million soldiers from Africa who were part of the Allied troops in the Second World War are not listed anywhere, while every village and town in the West has the names of those who gave up their lives, who were from Europe or America. How is it that the names of the American soldiers who lost their lives in the Vietnam War are listed in the memorial in Washington, but no one remembers the names of the millions killed by the US in Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia? How is it that the very same states that comprise the major funders of humanitarian aid, the USA, European Union, Germany, UK, and indeed the United Arab Emirates, are those that are responsible for funding widespread mayhem, atrocities, terror, mass killings of civilians, and destruction of infrastructure, and indeed are responsible also for their huge contribution to climate change? And why is it that, as Orwin has put it, humanitarianism is a distinctly Western development, which, with rare exceptions, humanitarian interventions is an encounter between the Western or Westernized nations and the non-Western ones? Well, I'm sure many of you have the answers to that, but permit me to share with you my own perspectives, and to do so, I'd like to sort of go back in history, because I think one of the shortcomings of many of us, who, whether we're working in NGOs and human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations, we often forget the historical context that that creates the situation that we have to deal with. In the Western world, in Europe, USA, and so on, there's a great celebration of the period of the Enlightenment, the European Enlightenment. But what is often forgotten is that the Enlightenment gave birth to liberalism at the same time that it gave birth to its conjoined twin, racism. So the Enlightenment, when we talk about liberalism, it is impossible to discuss it without looking at the other side of the coin, the same coin, that of racism. And the Enlightenment was made possible. I mean, the wealth and the luxury that was possible for the philosophers, the scientists, the artists, and the novelists and so on of the Enlightenment was made possible by a history of mass genocide, land grabbing, slavery, looting of the newly discovered Americas, to say nothing of the subsequent looting of Africa. And I think it's worthwhile reflecting that, you know, what that liberalism gave birth to in the USA was the birth of Western democracy. But we must recall that Western democracy, how it was born in the USA, allowed only white male slave owners to vote. Even the women folk of these slave owners were not allowed to vote. And indeed, I'd argue that Western democracy has always been an exclusivist project. It is defined by keeping people out of the privileges of democracy and allowing only a minority to as it were, deserve that. And this is because what was born in the period of liberalism and racism is that the world was divided into what might be called sacred and sacrificial zones. Domenico Losordo, an Italian philosopher who wrote about liberalism, counter history, talked about a sacred and profane spaces. But I much prefer to talk about the sacred and sacrificial zones. And let me try and explain what I mean by that. The sacred zone, like, at the beginning of the Western democracy, where only white male slave owners, how do they justify that? Because there was a perception that they were the epitome of being human, that they considered themselves human. And in so doing, everyone else outside of that privileged zone were part of the sacrificial zone. That is, those who were considered to be less than human or not human at all. I think it's important to understand that the borderland between the sacred and the sacrificial zones is not a fixed one. It depends on the nature of the struggles that go on amongst the people of the sacrificial zones and the concessions that are forced on the sacred zone, or sometimes concessions that the rulers of the sacred zone wish to make in order to continue their dominance. And I mean, there are lots of examples of this, but one I could cite immediately is that, while women were excluded from from democracy and from membership of the sacred zone, it was the struggles of the women's movement, both in America and internationally, that led to a situation where at least certain democratic rights were permitted, but in concession, the ruling class of the sacred space allowed a few to enjoy the privilege of the sacred space, the better to control these uprisings. And I think it's important to understand that the separation between the sacred and sacrificial zones is controlled by two dimensions. One is ideology. If you can make people believe that they are less than human, or that they are not yet ready to enjoy the full benefits of democracy, or whatever, that they're not quite human, they're not quite as human as we are, as this people in the sacred zone would say. It is the use of ideology. It's an expression of their hegemony over the people of the sacrifice zones, and the institutions of hegemony, the institutions of ideology, are the religious institutions, the media, the artists, the writers, the scientists, the parliamentarians, the historians, the academics, and indeed the humanitarians, the human rights organizations, the NGOs, and so on. And these institutions are what self-proclaim themselves to be part of civil society. And so the contrast between civil society, which is in a sense part of the sacred zone, and the uncivil society, those who are part of the sacrificial zones. But it's also important to understand that where the ideological and hegemonic institutions are not able to prevent the claims by those in the sacrificial zones that they are human, that they want to invent humanity, and that they want to expand the rights to which they have a claim. Where that happens, then violence becomes a really crucial aspect of of control. And one only has to look at our cities in the global south. And I think this is certainly true all over Africa, and I'm sure it is true many other places, that you have concurrent living. You have the sacred zone, the middle class zones, the areas where there are beautiful housing, there's water, there's nice infrastructure, and so on, sitting side by side with these informal settlements, these ghettos, and the ghettos are policed by armed troops or armed police. And one good example of the difference between these two spaces is that if the police today want to search the house of someone in the sacred zone, they would normally require to get from the judiciary, to get from the judges a search warrant, and they would have to present this search warrant in order to enter the house of the middle classes or the upper classes of our cities, or in fact, indeed, the countrysides. But when they want to search a house in the ghettos, they just go in and kick the doors down. They kill, they brutalize, and they do this entirely with impunity. And I think it's important, therefore, to understand that historically these two zones were at the origins of the Enlightenment, and that there has been a continuity of that separation of those who are considered human and those who are considered either less than human or not human enough, or are not considered human at all. And the vocabulary, the words change. You know, one time slaves were considered non-human. Then there are childlike. Then there are uncivilized. So the mission is to civilize them. And then it's the next thing is that they're underdeveloped, and now they are poor. So you have all these different words, these euphemisms for describing what the membership of the sacrifice zones are, and the justification for creating these zones has been sort of large-scale terror. I mean, we talk about the enslavement of Africans, their capture and enslavement. People talk about, maybe the figures vary, 10, 15 million people who were enslaved and crossed the Atlantic. Not all of them have survived the going across the Atlantic. But excuse me, but we must not forget, and there is now increasing data coming out on this, and certainly even back at when Senghor, the president of then president of the Senegal, his estimates was that that there were at least 20 million, if not more, who lost their lives in fighting against the enslavement. So it's not just those who were moved across the Atlantic to the Americas and to the Caribbean, but the death toll that was a result of this venture. And it was the capture and transport and destruction of societies. I mean, if you think about 20 million people being eliminated out of a society, you can understand that these were the most productive, the strongest, the most capable, and intellectually capable too, not just physically, who were captured and undermined the whole structures of societies in Africa, just so that they could become chattel slaves there. But as in all cases, people in the sacrifice zones are not passive. There may be periods when, as a result of brutality, etc., there is a quiet period, but there's always resistance. There's always that kind of, and eventually it explodes. And so, if one looks in the Americas, the number of maroon communities where slaves escaped and set up their own communities. And perhaps the most striking example is the Haitian Revolution in Saint-Domingue, where slaves who had recently been transported from the west of Africa were enslaved and were working on these plantations, producing sugar. The biggest source of sugar and for France and their revolution was to defeat the Spanish, to defeat the English, and to defeat the French in order to establish the first revolution, the first state that put slaves in charge of their society, but who proclaimed, going further than the French Revolution, in proclaiming that all people, irrespective of the color of their skin, are humans. And I think it's a really important proclamation that they face. And unfortunately, the consequence of that is that for more than 100 years, they continued to pay France a regular sum with interest, of course, to compensate the slave owners, the slave owners, not the slaves, to compensate the slave owners. I think also it's important to understand that, and this is a continuity, I will argue. It's not just a historical function, and that is the method of rule. The rise of Nazism in Europe was new for Europe when it arose, but something that's indistinguishable from it had long existed in many parts of Africa. The absolute totalitarian dictatorship of monopoly capital fused with the state dictatorship of the combination of monopoly and the state in it, that is essentially a part of Nazism and fascism. This dictatorship shared another essential factor with the later European dictatorships, a mass social base in the middle class, and that is to say, in the sacred space that we found in Germany, Italy, Spain, and so on. And as Aimé Césaire, the great poet, pointed out, why Europe's humanistic bourgeoisie could not forgive Hitler wasn't because of the crimes he committed, but the crime against the white person, the humiliation of the white man, and the fact that that he applied to Europe colonialist procedures which until then had been reserved exclusively for Arabs in Algeria, the coolies of India, the Negroes of America, and the so-called natives of Africa. And that form of rule is a persistence. It is something that has a continuity, not just under colonialism, but in the period after colonialism. And there's some important examples of the crisis and the dilemmas faced by humanitarians in the face of this. And where I come from in Kenya, the Land Freedom Army was faced by the most incredible terror by the British. Wide-scale torture, castration, rape, massive land grabbings, and vast sections of populations locked up in concentration camps. The sort of villagization program that was then subsequently used in Vietnam and in Zimbabwe and elsewhere. And there were these concentration camps where people were being tortured by the British. And we witnessed that, the largest women's organization in Kenya, the Maendeleo wa Wanawake, and the Christian Council of Kenya. Christian Council of Kenya was a forerunner of Christian Aid and similar institutions, and they felt the need to be able to look after those in the concentration camps, to provide service so that they could be tortured. They also played an active role of spying on their own communities, and they were given the promise that if they delivered people to the British, they would be exempt from all kinds of taxes and so on. And they also claimed that they were doing it because they were neutral. That is the neutrality that all of us want to manifest. But in a historical situation, we have to think about what that neutrality actually means. And of course, we saw in the post-Second World War period those who were called Africans as a derogatory term. The term African was actually a construction of Europe in the 16th century to be a shorthand for the non-human, which allowed enslavement and slavery. But the response was that there was a huge movement from Cape to Cairo, from Djibouti to Dakar, across the continent, of a mobilization of people who are claiming their humanity, who claiming their right to determine their own future. And we saw the uprisings that took place. And often, if they were led by radicals, those radicals like Cabral, Lumumba, Sankara, Nkrumah, and so on were assassinated, frequently by their own. They were betrayed by their own people. But the movement for independence was given. The energy was the desire of those who had been for decades, if not longer, been condemned as part of the sacrificial zone, claiming their right to emancipation, to freedom, and that the word African, which was previously a derogatory term, as I said, invented in the 15th century, became something that was associated with emancipatory desires. That to be African was something to be proud of because it was connected with the struggle for freedom. And it was this movement which was captured in a sense by the nationalist movements, who promised that we would meet all the demands if you supported us in negotiating our freedoms. And we must remember that it's not always just so straightforward. In Kenya, the Land and Freedom Army was completely decimated by bombings, torture, killings, and all kinds of outrageous activities by the British, and was completely defeated by the mid-50s, and which gave the British enough time to nurture a new class of what often people refer to as the petty bourgeoisie, the new emerging autocrats who would take over the country and become allied to the West and allied to the transnational corporations, allied to the mining companies and the international financial institutions, and in so doing, these autocrats became part of the sacred space, the international sacred space. They were given concessions to become members of that space, provided that their core function was to perpetuate the separation between the sacred and the sacrifice zones. So you see, even in a place like South Africa today, you have this massive separation between those who live in these informal settlements and those who live in these rich suburbs around Johannesburg, Pretoria, Cape Town, Durban, whatever. That was the sort of sacred zone. And we have no surprises then that they should, that the colonial way of ruling the sacrifice zones was a continuity. So, we saw 2-3 years ago the massacre of 34 miners at the Lonmin mines in Marikana in South Africa, and it was a classic colonial suppression of protesting mine workers, and there's a continuity then between the experience of the sort of fascist like domination of society of the sacrifice zones and the emerging situation in what were so-called independent countries, but effectively were the new colonies, the neo colonies, and in that time, in the early period of independence, we saw in Africa two things. One is, to some extent, there was a social contract by which, like in Kenya, there was no education, no health services, no water, and so on. All this was complete exclusion of any of these kind of benefits under colonialism. And in the space of less than 20 years, they transformed, these neo-colonial governments transformed the situation in which people at least could have the right to healthcare and so on, which previously was only provided for the so-called natives, was only provided by the missionaries, and who I've described elsewhere as being the precursors of the NGOs, particularly the development NGOs. In other words, the NGOs of today in much of Africa perform, take on the missionary position of filling in, and I'll come to that in a moment. But in this situation, these governments not only provided these kind of services for a period, but also made sure that all opposition was eliminated. So we saw assassinations and disappearances of opposition politicians, the establishment of one-party states, and so on. And where there were radical movements like Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, conspiracies by neighboring states to overthrow and assassinate him. And so we come to the period of neoliberalism, sort of from the early 80s onwards. And the experience of neoliberalism was fundamentally the dispossession of the commons, what they called privatization, but it was a form of dispossession of whatever gains those in the sacrifice zones had made in the struggle for independence. And I think a reminder here that the colonial ventures in Africa and elsewhere were driven by the need to dispossess people of their land, dispossess people of their right to livelihood, dispossess them of their right to self-determination, and it was the use of violence and ideology that allowed the colonial situation to develop. But it was fundamentally a process of dispossession, and so we see under liberalism, dispossession was normalized. Dispossession of the sacred space, the people of the sacred space, the colonies, etc. The dispossession was a fundamental form under liberalism. And the point I want to make here is that under neoliberalism, new liberalism, we see a reassertion of the values of dispossession, of expansion of the sacrifice zones under the term privatization. And it's really important to understand the nature of this privatization, because what was profitable to privatize, water, health, and privilege, education, large-scale agriculture, mining sector, and so on and so forth, telecommunications, all of that was privatized. And if these things were made a profit, they were given to one sector, the profit-making sector, who made a fortune out of this dispossession, this privatization. But there was another form of privatization as well. In Kenya, people spilt blood, sweat, tears to achieve their freedom. And part of that freedom was the right to education, the right to health, the right to water, etc. All that was privatized. And if you were part of the new sacrifice zones, the expanding sacrifice zones, then what happened? The health services were the declining social sector, which was insisted upon by not only the IMF and World Bank, but insisted upon by our own autocrats, was to transform where it was not profitable to give education or water or whatever, was given to the NGOs. So you have this other private sector, and let's be quite clear that the NGOs that we've all been part of, the human rights organizations, the humanitarian, they are part of a private sector. They are accountable not to the people, the movements that led to the freedom and for struggles, but to a self-selected ownership, and of course, because they depend on funding from the very same sources that create the destructions of this world. They are become, even if not intentionally wanting to do so, become used by that sector to become part of that privatization. So we now have to beg the Oxfam, Boxfam, Stoxfams of the world for health services, for education, etc., whereas previously it was a right. So and it was, of course, we can see from the rise of neoliberalism, sort of late 80s onwards, we see, it's boom time for humanitarians. It's boom time for the NGOs. I mean, there's an exponential growth of these institutions across the African continent and indeed elsewhere. And what they sought to do was to normalize poverty. It was a form of depoliticization. People didn't talk about the process of impoverishment. That is, that there was a system which made people poor, which exploited them, that turned them into less people considered less than human. But instead they were just poor, and it was almost an ontological description that Africans were always poor. That was the nature of it. So we saw an expansion under neoliberalism of the sacrifice zones through dispossessions, and a massive differentiation between those who are rich and those who are impoverished. The impoverishment growing exponentially, and the wealth of the minority growing exponentially. And it was both within our countries and internationally. And Oxfam has published some amazing reports about the way in which the rich have got richer, and those in the sacrifice zone become more impoverished. So we see the gradual re-establishment of the tenets of liberalism in this new period, and liberalism led to a brutal armed colonization of the world, and facilitated by missionaries and civil society. What we see under neoliberalism is the emergence of a brutal neo-colonization, facilitated by the NGOs, the humanitarian civil societies, and development organizations, and so on. And I mean, I think the COVID, the rise of the COVID-19 pandemic, I think is really illustrative of the situation that we are facing today. Because if you are today part of the middle classes, lots of NGOs, lots of humanitarian organizations talk about the global apartheid, about how the vaccines are just not made available in Africa. They're mainly just for the rich West. But what COVID tells us is that if you are you belong to the sacred zones, the middle classes, where the autocrats and their allies live in our cities, what you are pierced with is with needles. Okay? The difference is that those who are living in the ghettos, the informal settlements of our cities, are pierced with bullets, are pierced with truncheons. There is brutalization that takes place. There's a huge amount of evidence in South Africa, in Kenya, in Uganda, in many other countries where that is the norm, that those who are in those growing sacrifice zones are not provided with. So you have an internal apartheid system vis-a-vis the COVID provision of COVID vaccines, and as the protests, as people organize in these informal settlements, they organize and seek to achieve a greater freedom, are faced with the most incredible brutality and arrest of people. I mean, if one looks at, for example, Abahlali Basmandolo in South Africa, constantly their leadership are arrested, their places are burned down. There's this, and we're talking about an organization of 100,000 or so shack dwellers across South Africa, and they face increasingly and growing increasingly fascistic methods of rule, recalling the colonial conditions. And look where we are living now. We are facing an acceleration of the planetary destruction and climate chaos. There's the idea of freedom for the people in the sacrifice zone is by our autocrats sort of dispensed with. It's a loss of identity with any idea of freedom, replaced by ethnicity and tribal identity, and a rise of an exclusivist identity. And the dilemma we face is that, you know, there are all these so-called human rights, but which are treated essentially as only legal instruments rather than something that the oppressed organize around. And the dilemma we face is that, you know, the greatest violators of human rights is the state. And yet the whole human rights discourse is structured around having the state actually respond to the issue of so it's like asking the criminals to judge, or maybe it's about reforming the criminals, you know, making the tigers vegetarians, so to speak. But I think, you know, in the same time, and I really want to conclude here, is that the creation of these sacrifice zones does lead to a response by those in those zones to demand for freedoms in various ways. And we've seen this in Latin America with the rise of indigenous movements. We've seen it in the Caribbean. In Africa, there have been a whole series of explosions: Egypt, Tunisia, Algeria, Sudan, Burkina Faso, and so on and so forth. Similar things we're seeing farmers in India organize on an unprecedented scale. And here in Canada, where I am currently, and indeed in the rest of North America, you see the rise of these indigenous movements, which are really interesting, because in the past, so struggles were interest group struggles. They're saying, this is our land, you can't do this on our land. And a transition from that to becoming a reclamation of humanity, saying we are the land protectors, we are the protectors of our waters, we are the ones, and there's a whole ethos that's arising out of these struggles of inventing what it means to be human, and a proclamation of a universalist humanity, not just saying this is my land, so you can't do these things. No, they're saying we are protecting this earth from the destruction caused by capital, by the mining companies, by the transnational companies, and indeed with the collusion of our government. So, you know, what do humanitarians do in these set of circumstances? I mean, you know, we have this problem that people are put into situations where they are suffering. There's wars going on. There are destructions going on. There's a resurgence of colonization of parts of the world. And what do we do in those situations? And it seems to me that, you know, if one looks at the bully in the schoolyard, you know, what do? Do we wait for the survivors of that bullying and just look after them? Or do we challenge the capacity of those who are the bullies? And is it us who need to do that, or should our role be to nurture, to support the growth of those in the sacrifice zone, reclaiming and claiming their right to organize against the bullies? And I think there's some wonderful examples of what I would think, you know, are a form of humanitarianism that really I have enormous respect for. I mean, for example, when you think about under Marcos, and indeed subsequently, the same has happened in Indonesia, where there are mass demonstrations, and the nuns have come out and stood on the front line against the armed police and troops, to protect people from further abuse. We've seen the same thing happen with the rise of the Black Lives Matter movement in North America, where you see growing numbers of white people putting themselves in the line as a way of defending those who are protesting against the killing of young Black people. In Standing Rock, where the pipelines were threatening to undermine that whole thing, we had veterans come and kneel and ask forgiveness for what they've done and seek to protect the land protectors, to seek to protect the water protectors. And we saw in the rise of the Egyptian struggles, the Muslims surrounding the Coptics to allow them to pray on that bridge. It was an extraordinary sight. And what we are seeing is that the indigenous people are becoming the water and land protectors, the movement that wants to protect the earth for all of us, not just for themselves. And I can't help feeling that today, that's where our focus needs to be, to give support to those indigenous movement, to give support to those in the sacrifice zones, because they have an experience of dehumanization that makes them so clear about what it means to be human. And if humanitarianism is not about being human, what is it about? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Firoze. Thanks for your passion and this thought-provoking keynote speech. The first question that comes to my mind, actually, while listening to your historical retrospective is, how should humanitarian organization today reflect on this retrospective to move forward? For instance, should humanitarian organizations or especially NGOs that don't want to be completely into the political sphere per se, advocate against neoliberalism?
Well, there are two issues that are. It's not merely historical; it's happening today. Iraq,
about continuity, yeah.
Somali, Libya, etc., Kenya, South Africa. It's happening everywhere, and the question is, what do we do? Okay, and it's not enough to just say we'll deal with the dirt that's left over. That we must confront not neoliberalism, but the form that capital has taken today as being so exploitative, so horrendously looting on a wide scale, because the situation is only going to get worse. I mean, climate chaos is going to create lots of opportunities for humanitarians, huge opportunities, as many people leave their countries because they're no longer able to survive. But what do? Are you going to make money out of them? Or are we going to say, no, we have to find some way of opposing and enabling them to oppose? And I think this is the difference between the acts of solidarity and acts of charity. My argument is the acts of charity are not enough. What solidarity is about is a recognition that other people are human and that we share the same issues, we share the same enemies, and it is that, okay? There's a lovely, somebody made a wonderful expression at a conference I was at, saying, solidarity is what love looks like on the streets, okay? And it has to be that, because if you have a lover, there is no one who is dominant. There is no one who's setting the agenda. It has to be a mutuality. And my frustration with many NGOs and humanitarians is that they form marriages of dominance. And that in a sense, it's a reflection in a new situation, a reproduction of the structures of patriarchy, where one has the money and knows how to deal with and signs all the bank accounts and so on, and the other merely cooks the food so that they can continue that that relationship.
Are you urging the humanitarian organizations to rethink, yes, the principles of humanity, neutrality, that are founding principles of our action?
I think we all have to do this. Okay, anyone who sees the suffering that is going on, there are ways of responding, but it cannot be limited to merely a charitable response. This is the destruction and creation of sacrifice zones, the expansion of these are precisely what is destroying this world. It's destroying this planet. We're not going to change this by just looking after those who can no longer live because the temperatures are so high. We have to stop this process happening. We have to now deal with the causes of it. And I know this is a dilemma because, yes, we need to respond to humans who are suffering, but it's a political problem, not a technical one. It has to be approached politically. Otherwise, we're left with just the destruction.
Interestingly, in your presentation, there were lots of vocabulary linked to the judiciary, or at least legal terms, oppression, depossession, rights. But I've not really heard your view on global justice, per se. How would you see NGOs today in the current landscape would position themselves towards global justice, considering the climate emergency and the chaos in humanity?
I think all of what I've been speaking about is the struggle for global justice. It has been about the struggles of those who are considered less than human or underdeveloped or poor, the victims. If the problem with seeing the world in terms of victims is that we become saviors, and saviors can only survive if they have victims, so they become part of the victimization process. In other words, ideologically, they become part of the problem, and they don't need to be, because I know that humanitarians are motivated by the finest motives, but the issue is not a technical one so much as a political one. And unless they stand up to that, then I think we only just see the situation getting worse. There is a wide-scale global injustice in the rise of neoliberalism, in the rise of the recolonization of the world under new circumstances.
Thank you so much, Firoze. Thanks for elaborating your thoughts, for starting this Humanitarian Congress 2021 on a passionate note, and I'm sure that it will set the tone for the coming sessions.